My husband threw his drink in my face. 200 people were watching. He screamed that I'd been looking at other men. I wiped the wine off my face with the back of my hand, walked straight to the microphone, and told the room what he did to his first wife. The life vests were still sealed in their plastic, tags never cut, sitting in a storage unit my husband had sworn only held his dead grandmother's furniture. Bayview Self-Storage, Unit 214, $41 a month, auto-paid from an account I didn't know existed until I found the statement folded inside one of the vests, like a bookmark nobody was ever supposed to find. 6 months before that afternoon, I'd found the key to that unit taped under our bathroom sink. I asked Emmett what had opened. He told me it was old furniture, boxes from before we met, nothing worth mentioning. I let it go, the way I'd learned to let a lot of things go by then. It wasn't instinct that finally got me into that unit alone. It was his mother, at Thanksgiving, saying a dead woman's name out loud, and then swallowing it whole, like she could take it back if she just stopped talking fast enough. But you need the 6 months before that Tuesday first. None of it makes sense without them. I met Emmett Vance on a dock, which sounds more romantic than it was. I'd been teaching beginner sailing out of the Bayview Marina for 11 years by then, ASA certified, the kind of instructor harbor families requested by name because I didn't yell, and I never let anyone leave the slip without checking their own life vest twice. Emmett showed up for a private lesson on a Tuesday afternoon in a boat too nice for a man who couldn't tie a cleat hitch, and he made fun of himself about it before I could, which I liked. He asked good questions. He tipped the dock boys without being asked. He remembered my coffee order by the second lesson. I didn't know yet that his first wife had drowned on a sailboat 4 years before he ever set foot on mine. He told me, eventually, in the gentlest voice I'd ever heard from a grown man. A boating accident 6 years back, a freak wave off the point, the kind of thing insurance adjusters call an act of God, and everyone else just calls terrible luck. He said he hadn't been able to look at a boat for 2 years afterward. I remember thinking that explained the tremor in his hands the first time he took the wheel with me beside him, and feeling something soften in me that I now recognize, looking back, as the exact moment I decided to stop asking questions I hadn't even thought to ask yet. We married 3 years ago, in a garden behind his mother's house. 40 guests, no cell phones allowed at the ceremony. His idea, romantic at the time. I kept my own name, Fenwick, mostly for the marina's paperwork, and if I'm honest, some small stubborn part of me that wanted one thing in my life to stay mine outright. Emmett never said anything about it out loud. He just stopped introducing me by name at his events after that, which I noticed and didn't examine. The way you don't examine a hairline crack in a windshield until the whole thing goes at once. My own parents had passed within a year of each other back when I was 26. My mother first, my father 11 months later, in the specific way widowers sometimes just stop, and I'd spent most of my 20s treating the marina crew as the closest thing I had to family, a rotating cast of dock hands and old salts who'd watched me grow up on that water. When I married into the Vances, I told myself I'd finally gotten a whole family back at once. A mother-in-law who remembered my birthday, holidays with a full table, someone to call when the power went out. It took me longer than it should have to notice that every one of those gatherings happened on Vance terms. In Vance houses, with Vance guest lists Emmett curated without ever asking who I might have wanted there instead. Our garage always smelled faintly of teak oil, from a dock box Emmett had been refinishing since before we married and never once finished. I kept a jar of loose quarters by the front door for the harbor parking meter, and a photo of my grandmother's old Cape Dory taped inside a kitchen cabinet where only I ever looked. The Delacroix wind chime next door rang every evening around 6 when the harbor breeze picked up, which was how I knew most nights when to start dinner without checking a clock. I remember all of it clearly, the ordinary furniture of a life, right up until I understood how much of it had been arranged around me instead of with me. The silent treatment started our first year. 3 days of nothing. No argument, no explanation, just a door closed a little too carefully and a version of Emmett who looked through me at the dinner table if I laughed too long at another man's joke at a party or thanked a waiter with too much warmth. The first time it happened, I followed him into the bedroom and asked straight out what I'd done. He looked at me like the question itself was proof of something. "You really don't know," he said, not a question, and turned off the lamp. I lay awake trying to reconstruct the whole evening from memory, cataloging every laugh, every hand I'd touched in passing, looking for the crime. I told myself it was love that worried, love that noticed things other people missed. When I finally asked him about the pattern itself, 18 months in, he told me, very calmly, that he wasn't punishing me, that he just needed time to stop picturing things that made his chest hurt. I remember apologizing to him. I remember thinking that was generous of him, to be so honest about his own pain instead of blaming me for causing it. It would be a long time before I understood that both of those things had been true at once, and that only one of them had ever been an accident. By year 2, he was reading my text over my shoulder at dinner, not sneaking it, just leaning in openly, the way a man checks the weather. By year 3, I'd stopped wearing anything he hadn't approved first, not because he'd ever once said the word approved, but because the one time I wore a green dress he hadn't seen to his business partner's retirement party, he didn't speak to me until Sunday, and by then I'd learned the math well enough to stop running the experiment. I told myself every marriage has its negotiations. I told myself worse things happen to other women. I got very good in those years at telling myself things. My college roommate, Odette, used to fly in every March for a long weekend, just the two of us, a tradition that predated Emmett by a decade. The third third year, he booked us a surprise anniversary trip to the coast the exact same week. Tickets already purchased, non-refundable, presented to me at breakfast with a smile that dared me to be anything but grateful. I called Odette from the bathroom of that resort to cancel, my voice doing the thing it always did around Emmett by then, bright and apologetic and slightly too fast. She went quiet on the other end for a long moment and then said carefully that this was the third year in a row something had come up the same week in March, and did I ever notice that? I told her she was reading too much into a coincidence. She didn't call as often after that. I told myself that was normal too. Friendships drift, people get busy, and didn't let myself finish the thought that the drifting had a shape to it, and the shape was Emmett's calendar. 2 months ago, I found a GPS tracker zip-tied under my car, wedged behind the bumper where I only found it because I was on my knees looking for a dropped earring. When I asked him about it, he said he just wanted to know I was safe. Voice soft, hand on my cheek, the exact tone he'd used the night he explained the silent treatments, which should have told me something, and instead, for one more night, told me nothing at all. I put it back exactly where I found it and said nothing else. That was the first time I understood, clearly and without the fog I usually thought through around him, that I wasn't going to solve this by asking him about it directly ever again. The storage unit key had come 6 months before the tracker, which meant that by the time I found the second thing hidden from me, I already had a small, cold habit of noticing and saying nothing. I found it taped under the bathroom sink while replacing a leaking trap, a small brass key with no fob, no label, nothing to explain itself. I'd asked about it once, lightly, at breakfast. Didn't we get rid of everything from before we met during the move? And watched him decide in real time whether the question was dangerous. He didn't look up from his coffee. Storage was cheaper than hauling it to donation, he said. Some of his mother's old dining furniture, nothing worth the trip. He'd apparently concluded the question wasn't dangerous, because he answered it easily, and I believed him for 6 months. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where I suspected everything the whole time isn't the true one. I believed him because believing him was easier, and because some part of me I'm not proud of had gotten very skilled, by then, at choosing easier. Then his mother mentioned Adeline at Thanksgiving. Helene Vance was 71, sharp as a fillet knife, and almost never careless with her words, which is exactly why the slip landed the way it did. We were clearing plates, and she said, apropos of nothing, "Well, you actually eat, dear, not like poor Adeline," and then went so pale and so quiet that I understood, before I understood anything else, that I had just heard something I was never supposed to hear. Emmett changed the subject so fast I almost missed the maneuver, asking his father about the Steelers, a team none of us had discussed in 4 years of holidays, and it worked on everyone else at that table. It did not work on me. I looked her up that night, in bed, phone brightness turned all the way down, Emmett asleep beside me with one arm slung heavy across my hip like an anchor. Adeline Vance, married to Emmett for 6 years, drowned on their sailboat 6 years ago, off the same point he'd once told me he could no longer look at. Ruled accidental by the County Marine Patrol. One small obituary, 4 sentences, no photograph, no follow-up articles. A marina, my marina, the one I'd worked at for 11 years, 3 slips down from where Emmett now kept his boat, that I had never once heard mention her name. Helene told me something once, years before any of this, that I didn't understand the weight of until much later. We were doing dishes after a holiday dinner, and she said, apropos of nothing, that Emmett's father had run their house the way he ran his shipping company, every decision his, every dollar accounted for, every argument won before it started, and that Emmett had sworn as a teenager he'd never let a woman make him feel as small as his father had made her feel. I remember thinking at the time that it was a sweet thing to say about a man who clearly adored his wife. It would be years before I understood that Emmett hadn't rejected his father's blueprint at all. He'd just decided he'd rather be the one holding the pen. I opened the storage unit alone on a Tuesday, while Emmett was at a board meeting across town, using a key I'd had copied at a hardware store 2 exits from the marina, in a town where nobody thinks twice about a woman making a spare for her own husband's storage unit. Inside were 4 boxes, labeled in handwriting that wasn't Emmett's. Round, careful letters I'd later learn were Adeline's own, from the year she'd moved them in herself. 2 life vests, still sealed in their original plastic, tags never cut, a brand the marina had stopped carrying 5 years ago. A stack of swim lesson brochures from my own marina's program, unopened, dated the summer before she died. Lessons Adeline had apparently signed up for and never taken, or never been allowed to take. And in a plain manila folder near the bottom, printed emails between Emmett and a name I recognized from every hull insurance policy on our own dock, Baymark Marine Underwriters, dated 2 weeks before the accident. Subject line, payout timeline, expedited claims. He'd asked, in writing, in his own words, how fast a payout could process after a death at sea. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit for a long time. I want to tell you I felt something dramatic. Rage, or grief, or fear. Mostly what I felt was very, very cold. The specific cold of understanding that the man asleep next to me every night had spent real money keeping something climate-controlled and locked for 6 years, and none of it was furniture. And all of it had been waiting for someone to finally come looking. I read the swim lesson brochures cover to cover, sitting on that cold concrete, the way you read a menu at a restaurant you already know you're not going to order from. A summer program, 6 sessions, a phone number for the marina's front desk that I recognized because it was mine. Adeline had called my own desk some June before I ever worked there, and asked for lessons she never got to take. I found Adeline's sister the same week through an old wedding photo someone had tagged online years ago and never taken down, Marisol Devereaux, standing beside her sister in a green bridesmaid dress, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. I sent her a message that took me 40 minutes to write and said almost nothing. She answered within the hour. She told me later she'd been waiting 6 years for someone, anyone, to ask her a real question about her sister's death instead of a kind one. We met 4 times over the next 2 months, always at her kitchen table, always with her 2 cats supervising from the windowsill. The first time, we barely spoke about Adeline at all. Marisol made tea neither of us drank and asked me careful, sideways questions about my own marriage that I understood only afterward had been her quietly checking whether I was safe enough to keep talking to. The second time, she brought out a shoebox of photographs. Adeline on that same sailboat 2 summers before she died, laughing, sunburned, alive in a way the small obituary had never once suggested she'd been. I looked at those photographs longer than I meant to, because somewhere in the middle of that box, I stopped seeing a stranger's dead wife and started seeing a woman who had sat at this exact table, worried about the exact things I worried about, in the years right before I ever met the man who would go on to marry me too. The third visit, she showed me the letter Adeline had mailed her the week she died, handwritten, folded into eighths, the kind of letter you write when you already suspect you might need someone to have it. It said, in Adeline's own careful round handwriting, that if anything ever happened to her out on that boat, it wasn't an accident, and that she loved her sister more than she'd ever managed to say out loud. Marisol had read it so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. By the 4th visit, she showed me the marina logs from the week of the accident, the ones Emmett had, according to the original file, misplaced while helping investigators reconstruct the timeline, and that had never resurfaced until Marisol found copies filed at the harbor master's office under a clerk who'd simply never been asked to look. She showed me the original police report, thin as a pamphlet, signed by a Sergeant Foster Aldwin of the County Marine Patrol, 19 years on the water by then, who had ruled the death accidental in 11 days flat, and who, when Marisol tried to reopen the case 4 years ago, told her, she still had the voicemail, that grief made people see conspiracies in weather. She'd driven 3 hours to his office that year with a binder of her own, hand-assembled, full of the same instinct I now had evidence for, and he'd walked her out to the parking lot himself, kindly, the way you walk out someone you feel sorry for rather than someone you believe. She told me she'd sat in her car in that lot for 40 minutes afterward before she trusted herself to drive home, and that she'd almost given up entirely after that, until a strange woman she'd never met sent her a message 6 years too late asking a real question for the first time. One more piece came from somewhere I hadn't thought to look. Silas Okonkwo, the marina's dockmaster for going on 30 years, mentioned to me offhand one afternoon, he had no idea what he was handing me, that he remembered the day Adeline's boat came back in without her, because he'd been the one to log it, and because Emmett's own truck hadn't been in the marina lot at all that morning, not until after the Coast Guard had already been called. He'd never been asked about it. Nobody investigating 6 years ago had thought to check the parking log of a marina 3 slips down from where the boat launched, because nobody investigating 6 years ago had thought there was anything to check. There was one Tuesday I nearly lost the whole thing before it ever got anywhere. Emmett came home early from the office, unannounced, while my laptop sat open on the kitchen island to an email draft to Marisol I hadn't finished sending. I closed it too fast, the trackpad skidding, and he asked, mild as anything, who I was writing to. I told him the marina's insurance broker, about our own liability policy renewal, which happened to be true that same month for an entirely unrelated reason, the only lie in the whole thing I ever told easily, because some part of it wasn't a lie at all. He nodded and went to change out of his suit. I sat very still at that island for a full minute after he left the room, listening to my own pulse, before I moved the rest of my research into a cloud folder he'd never once asked the password to, because in 3 years of marriage he had never once needed to ask. I brought everything to Detective Imogen Castellan, 16 years with the county's cold case unit, a woman who listened to the first 10 minutes of my story without writing anything down, and then asked, very quietly, whether I had a safe place to sleep that wasn't my own house. That question told me more about how seriously she was taking this than anything she said afterward. She explained that a 6-year-old drowning ruled accidental wasn't easy to reopen on a letter and a hunch, but an insurance email asking about expedited payout timelines 2 weeks before a death, paired with a sister's letter and a widower who'd since remarried and was, by his own new wife's account, still paying to store his dead wife's untouched safety equipment, was a different kind of file entirely. She brought in Petra Lindqvist, a fraud investigator with 14 years at the State Insurance Commission, who confirmed within a week that Baymark had processed Adeline's payout in 9 days, a policy that typically took 6 to 8 weeks to clear, expedited at the policyholder's own written request. The same request sitting in the folder I'd photographed on the floor of that storage unit. Castellan also sent the 2 sealed life vests out for examination to a marine equipment specialist named Otis Berglund, 26 years certifying safety gear for the Coast Guard Auxiliary, who confirmed in a 2-page report that the foam inside hadn't degraded the way 6 years in a damp storage unit should have caused, meaning the vests had been purchased and sealed sometime after Adeline's death, not before it, a detail that turned "he never let her take swim lessons" from a sad footnote into something closer to staged evidence evidence of a concern Emmett had never actually had while she was alive. Getting the rest took paperwork I never saw, and couldn't have understood if I had. Castellan walked the file to the district attorney's office herself, and a judge signed a subpoena compelling Baymark to release 6 years of correspondence on the policy, not just the one email Emmett hadn't known Adeline had printed and boxed. The DA's office wanted the case airtight before anyone touched Emmett directly. Not for his sake, Castellan told me flatly, but because a rich man with a good lawyer only needed one procedural mistake to walk, and she wasn't going to hand him one for the sake of moving faster than the evidence could carry her. Castellan told me, the second time we met, that what she needed most wasn't more documents. It was time and my own continued ordinary presence in my own marriage, long enough for the case to develop without Emmett suspecting anything had moved. I hated that answer. I understood it anyway. I'd been doing that particular kind of waiting, without knowing its name, for 3 years already. The Vance Foundation Gala was scheduled for the last Saturday in January, the night Emmett was being honored as Philanthropist of the Year for a scholarship fund that, I now understood with a nausea I hadn't fully processed, had been seeded in part by a 6-year-old insurance payout. Marisol and I had been planning for 6 weeks by then. She'd agreed, after I asked her twice to be sure, to attend as a foundation donor's guest. I'd arranged her seat at table 14 myself through the event coordinator, who owed me a favor from a wedding I'd helped anchor 2 summers back. Faye Corwin, a reporter with 9 years at the Business Journal, found me instead of the other way around. She'd been quietly working her own angle on Baymark's expedited claims pattern for 3 weeks by then, unrelated to Adeline entirely, chasing a pattern across 4 other policyholders. Castellan connected us on the condition that I say almost nothing on the record until the case was ready, and Faye agreed without complaint, which told me she understood exactly how much bigger the story in front of her was than the one she'd started with. She'd be at the gala too, credentialed, cameras cleared, watching, with a piece already drafted, and an editor who trusted her enough to hold the button until she gave the word. I told myself getting dressed that night in a navy dress Emmett had actually chosen, full circle, deliberately, I wanted him comfortable, that I was ready. My hands weren't shaking yet. That came later in the ballroom, somewhere between the string quartet and the moment his acceptance speech ended to 200 people on their feet. The ballroom smelled like lilies and candle wax, and the specific expensive nothing of a room where everyone's perfume cost more than my first car. Helene sat at the head table in navy of her own, dabbing her eyes through Emmett's speech about legacy and second chances, and I remember watching her hands and thinking about the dishes we'd washed together years ago, wondering how much of what I now knew she'd always half known too. In the careful, unexamined way families know things they've agreed never to say out loud. Marisol caught my eye once across the room, just once, and looked away fast enough that no one else would have noticed. I spent the cocktail hour holding a glass of sparkling water I never finished, the folder against my hip inside my clutch like something with a pulse. I was near the bar afterward, talking to an old friend of my father's I hadn't seen in years, when Emmett crossed the room fast enough that his wine sloshed over the rim before he ever reached me. He didn't ask who the man was. He didn't lower his voice. He threw the wine and screamed, in front of donors and board members and Faye Corwin's photographer, that I knew better than to look at other men. The room went dead silent in the specific way 200 people go silent when they've just watched something they'll be describing for years. A waiter offered me a napkin without meeting my eyes. My heart was hammering hard enough that I could feel it behind my teeth. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and walked to the stage, where the microphone still stood from his acceptance speech 20 minutes earlier. Security hesitated, looking to each other instead of to me, the way people do when the woman walking toward a stage doesn't match any threat they've been trained to expect. Nobody stopped me. My husband just threw a drink in my face for talking to a man, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He's telling everyone here it's because I provoked him. He said the exact same thing about his first wife, right up until she drowned alone on a boat he never once got on with her. Gasps rippled through the tables. Emmett's face went white, then a deep, furious red. Sit down, he hissed, already moving toward the stage. I held up the folder Marisol had given me 2 nights earlier, the one I'd been carrying through an entire cocktail hour like it might catch fire. Life vests still sealed in the box, swim lessons he never let her take, an email asking his insurance company how fast a payout clears after a death at sea, sent 2 weeks before she died. That's a lie, Emmett said, louder now, close enough to the stage that I could see his hand closing around the microphone stand. Ask her yourself, I said. Somewhere near the back, a phone was already up, filming. The chairman of Emmett's own board sat frozen with his fork halfway to his mouth. And that's when Marisol stood up from table 14, still in green, and started walking toward the stage. She didn't stop at the foot of it. She climbed the 2 steps in low heels, straightened, and took the microphone out of Emmett's hand before he'd fully registered that she was reaching for it. A small, decisive motion that seemed to cost her nothing, though I knew it had cost her 6 years. My sister's name was Adeline Devereaux Vance, she said, to a room that had gone so quiet I could hear the ice machine behind the bar. She wrote me a letter the week she died. I have it in my bag right now, and I will show it to any reporter, any detective, any lawyer in this room who wants to read it tonight. She looked at Emmett, not raising her voice at all, which somehow landed harder than shouting would have. You told everyone she went out on that boat happy. You never once got on that boat with her. Not that day, not any day that summer. I have the marina logs that prove it. Emmett lunged for the folder in my hands instead of answering her, which was the wrong thing to do in front of a photographer already mid mid-burst. Two security guards who had hesitated at a woman walking calmly to a stage did not hesitate at a man grabbing for evidence in front of 200 witnesses. They had him by both arms before he reached the second step. "She was going to leave anyway," he said. Not to me, not to Marisol, to no one in particular. The words coming out of him like something that had been under pressure for 6 years and finally found the crack. The room heard it. Faye Corwin's photographer heard it. Detective Castellan, who I'd told to be somewhere nearby that night without ever telling her exactly why, heard about it 11 minutes later, because 3 separate donors called the non-emergency line before I'd even made it off the stage. Then, almost in the same breath, half the room's phones lit up at once. A soft, staggered wave of blue light across dozens of tables, the specific sound of 200 people receiving the same notification within 30 seconds of each other. Faye's piece had gone live on an embargo she'd set for 9 o'clock exactly, weeks before either of us knew it would land in the same room as the man it was about. Baymark fraud investigation opens into 9-day payout on Vance drowning. The foundation's own board chairman read it off his phone, standing 3 feet from the man he'd handed an award to 20 minutes earlier. Emmett didn't spend that night in a jail cell. Obstruction and insurance fraud charges take paperwork, not handcuffs at a gala, but he left in the back of a patrol car an hour later anyway, after Detective Castellan arrived, and asked him, in front of what remained of the board, to come answer some questions voluntarily. He agreed, mostly, I think, because refusing in front of that many donors would have cost him something he still hadn't fully understood he'd already lost. I didn't sleep at our house that night, or for the 6 weeks after. Castellan had been right about that part too. I filed for divorce 9 days later, and for a protective order the same week, once the department's domestic violence unit reviewed 3 years of documented silent treatments, a GPS tracker, and a locked storage unit as what Castellan's own paperwork called plainly a pattern of coercive control, a term I'd never once heard applied to my own marriage until a stranger with a badge said it out loud and made it real. He'd spent 6 years making sure nobody looked too closely at what happened to Adeline. That night, 200 people did, and so, eventually, did everyone else. 8 months later, a grand jury indicted Emmett on charges of insurance fraud, obstruction of a death investigation, and, after Petra Lindqvist's team traced 2 more expedited adventure sport policy inquiries he'd filed in the 18 months before Adeline died, 1 count of murder in the 2nd degree. Sergeant Foster Aldwin, retired now, gave a deposition admitting he'd never once checked whether the life vests aboard the Vance's own sailboat had actually been used that day. Detective Castellan told me it was the hardest admission she'd gotten out of anyone in 16 years of hold cases. I moved back into the small apartment above the marina office, the one I'd never quite gotten around to giving up, even after 3 years of a Vance address. Marisol comes by most Sundays now. We don't always talk about her sister, which I've come to think is its own kind of progress. Every Saturday morning, I teach a free beginner sailing class off the same dock where Emmett once made fun of himself for not knowing a cleat hitch from a bowline. 6 kids showed up the first week, all from the scholarship fund the foundation quietly renamed once the board understood exactly where its seed money had come from. Every one of them wears a life vest that's actually been worn, buckled, checked twice, salt-stained by June, the kind Adeline Devereaux Vance never got the chance to put on.